Hey guys, Ben here, 3dgladiator.com, and in this week's tutorial I will teach you how to create simple stitch brushes in ZBrush. So we will create the basic stitch mesh first, then we turn it into a brush and use the curve functions to apply a row of stitches to the surface. So let's get started.
I have already opened ZBrush, and as you can see, my user interface probably looks a little bit different than yours, and that's because I've adjusted the colors and I've also repositioned some of the icons and tools. And you can do this too. I have published a video tutorial series at the beginning of 2019. It consists of 6 parts. The link is in the description below, and there I describe in detail how to adjust the user interface, besides how to make use of some of these preference settings in ZBrush and use them to your advantage. The user interface files I use can be also found on 3dgladiator.com. So if you go there and subscribe to my newsletters, I will send you an email with the download link so you can use my user interface files for your projects. I start with a single stitch first, so I go to the tool palette and choose the cylinder 3D, draw it to the canvas, enter the edit mode by hitting the T key. And before I turn it into a polymesh 3D, let's simplify the cylinder by going to the initialize subpalette. And here I set the H divide down to something like 12 and the V divide to the lowest value possible, like 4 in this case. And we can see the mesh a little bit better by enabling the polyframe. That can be done by hitting the Shift F key on the keyboard. And this looks like a good start for our stitch. So I turn it now into a polymesh 3D by clicking on this button. And when I do this, a polygroup gets immediately assigned to the mesh. And now I show the floor by hitting Shift P. And I also activate symmetry by hitting the X key on the keyboard. And if I now hover over the mesh, you can see that I have two points or 2 cursors available to manipulate the mesh. And in this case I want to change the axis because I would like to work on the caps simultaneously. So I'll go to the transpose palette and down here to the symmetry section and disable the X symmetry and enable Y symmetry. And now I should be able to work on both ends of the cylinder at the same time. So let's quickly hide the floor again by hitting Shift P. And now I switch to the C modeler brush. I have mine placed below the canvas. You can find it in the brush palette, of course, or in the quick menu. So if you hit the B key on the keyboard to bring up the quick menu and then the C key again to show only brushes that begin with the letter C, you can choose the C modeler brush also from here. And then I hover over these faces and select them with the Alt key, like so. And this assigns this gray color here. And when I let Alt go and click on the gray faces, ZBrush turns them or assigns a new polygroup to them. Then with the C modeler brush still selected, I hover over some of these faces and hit the spacebar to open up the C modeler menu or the settings. And here I make sure that the Q mesh is selected, and for the target I switch from single poly to polygroup all. So this means that the functions I'm gonna apply next gets applied to the entire polygroup. And in this case I start extruding the faces like so. And because the symmetry mode is selected or enabled, this happens on both sides of the cylinder. And then I hover over the newly created faces again, press the spacebar to open up the menu, and I switch from the Q mesh to the transpose tool. And here again I make sure that polygroup all is selected. And when I now click on the polygroup, the gizmo appears, and I can reset the position of the gizmo or center it to the masked part by clicking on this center button. And I can also reset the orientation of the gizmo by hitting on the reset orientation icon. And before you do that, make sure that you press the Alt key so only the gizmo itself gets affected. So let's try this first without pressing Alt. then you pretty much mess up the entire mesh. So let me quickly undo this by hitting Ctrl C. And when I now press the Alt key first and then click on the rotation, only the gizmo gets affected without adjusting the mesh. And then from the side view here, I move these little guys down a little bit and scale them also down like so. And then I hit the Q key to switch back to my C modeler brush again. I hover over the faces, press the space bar to go back to the Q mesh function, and then I extrude the faces one more time. Select the transpose tool, reset the gizmo, move the guys down like so, make them a little bit smaller. And let's do this one more time. So I'm hovering over the faces, select the Q mesh, extrude them, switch back to the transpose tool, click on the poly group, reset the orientation of the gizmo, move it down like so, and also scale it down a little bit. And last but not least, I'm gonna delete the caps by hovering over them, hitting the space bar again, select delete, make sure that the target is set to polygroup all, and then I simply click on it to delete them. And now I clear the mask. I have set a shortcut key for this, so this would be a Ctrl-Shift-A in my case. You can also clear the mask by hitting the Control key and draw a little rectangle next to the model like so, or you can go to the tool palette, open up the masking subpalette and clear the mask here. And if I hover over the clear button, you can see that a shortcut key is already assigned to it, so the Ctrl-Shift-A combination. And then with the C modeler brush still selected, let's adjust the edge loops a little bit. So I hover over an edge, and when I now press the space bar, transpose is already selected, and for the target I switch from edge to complete edge loop, and I simply click on an edge here, so the entire edge loop gets selected, and I can now place or position the edge loop like so. And I also do this for the middle section. And clear the mask again. Perfect. Then let's see what the stitch looks like with a few subdivision levels on it. And you can simply preview that by hitting the D key on the keyboard, and then you get prompted with this message where ZBrush tells you that the mesh currently has 0 subdivisions. Would you like to activate dynamic subdivisions instead? And I click on yes. And what this does is it pretty much enables in the geometry subpalette here the dynamic function. You can enable and disable it also by hitting the button. And this gives you a preview of the mesh with subdivision levels applied to it without actually subdividing the mesh. And you can set the level of subdivisions with this slider. So it's currently set to 2. When I set it to 3, the surface is a little bit more detailed. And I can already tell that our stitch is probably a little bit too thick. So I exit the dynamic subdivision preview again by hitting Shift D on the keyboard. Go down to the deformation subpalette, and here I look for the inflate function and move the slider to the left maybe 2 times like so. And when I enter dynamic subdivision again by hitting the D key, it looks already a little bit better. So last but not least, I enable the floor again and exit symmetry. You can do this on the transformation palette, or simply hit X on the keyboard, and then I press W to bring the gizmo again, and I reset the gizmo first, center it to the object, and then I rotate the stitch so it aligns with the floor a little bit better. And I do this in incremental steps by hitting the shift key while rotating, so you can rotate it in 5-degree steps. And then I simply center the whole thing to the y-axis on the grid by clicking on the little house icon like so. And finally, I also scale it down just a tad. And now it's time to save the mesh as a C tool. And you do that under the tool palette, save as, and here you can save it as a C tool. Before I turn the mesh into a brush, it's important to note that the position of the mesh on the grid or in 3D space actually does not matter. What matters is the position of the mesh on the 2.5D canvas. So I can show you this in a few simple steps. I hit the floor first by hitting the Shift P on the keyboard. Then I exit the polyframe by hitting Shift F again. And let's say I place it something like this on the canvas, and when I then go to the brush palette and open up the create sub palette and click on create insert mesh and create a new brush. So before you do that, please also make sure that the standard brush is selected and not another brush like the transpose or the Z modeler brush, because this cause some trouble from time to time. So standard brush is selected, then I click on create insert mesh in the brush palette and create a new mesh. And if I now switch to another tool, so I hit the D key to exit edit mode, clear the canvas by hitting Ctrl N, go to the tool palette, select a sphere primitive, draw it on the canvas, enter the edit mode again, and then let's turn it into a polymesh 3D and add a subdivision level to it by hitting Ctrl D. And then I delete any lower subdivision levels like so. And then I make sure that I select the new brush that we have just created, and I now start drawing it to the model. And as you can see, it gets placed exactly the same way we had it on the canvas when we were pressing the create insert mesh button. So let's do this one more time. Switch over to the stitch mesh again, and let's say I place it like so, and then I click on create insert mesh brush again, and this time I append it to the currently selected brush. And then I go to our sphere object again, it was this one here, and make sure that the new brush or the new tool of the insert mesh brush is selected, and then I continue drawing it on the surface, and you can see now that it gets placed exactly the way I had it on the 2.5D canvas before I was pressing the create insert mesh brush. So keep that in mind. The actual position of the mesh is not important, but how it is placed on the canvas before you press this button tells ZBrush how it gets captured and how it is positioned when you draw brush strokes to the surface. So now let me quickly repeat this one last time, but this time I place it correctly. So here's our stitch model again, and I place it like so, and maybe I also tilt it a little bit, and then I press the create insert mesh brush again, and this time I select new and switch back to the sphere model. Make sure that the right brush is selected, and then I place it on the model like so, and it looks pretty much the way I want it. Now all you have to do is go to the stroke palette and enable the curve mode. And let me quickly undo the adjustments on our sphere here a couple of times like so, and with our stitch selected and the curve mode active, I can now start drawing stitches or a row of stitches to the sphere. And every time I do this, the curve that I've created before gets deleted. So at the moment the curve is active, and you can see this by hovering over with the cursor, and then the cursor turns from red to blue, and a blue cursor indicates that you can adjust the curve. So I can, for instance, move the curve points around. And you can also set the size of the brushes independently. So I can, for instance, make the blue brush a lot bigger than my regular red cursor. And that's because you can use the red cursor to change the size of the single meshes here. So if I move the cursor away from the curve and set it to a lower value like so, and with the curve still active, I simply click on it, and then the stitches become a lot smaller. And of course it works also the other way around. So if I make my cursor a lot larger and then click on the still active curve, the single mesh pieces become a lot bigger. You can also make curves longer. So if I draw a new curve here like so, and then let's make the stitches a little bit bigger. If you come close to the end of the still active curve, like so, you can see that a little red line appears, and that indicates that you can now continue drawing the curve like so. So if I come close to the endpoint again and move the cursor a little bit away from the endpoint until the red line appears, I can continue drawing the curve. And you've probably already noticed that the mesh is not perfectly intersecting. It's touching the surface, but it's not really intersecting it. And you can change that by having curve still active. And then I go to the brush palette, down to the depth sub palette, and I change this embedded value. So I set it to 0. And I now simply click on the curve. Well, 0 was in this case a little bit too much. Let's try 20, for instance. 20 is a lot better. And by doing so, or 25, you can change how much the mesh intersects with the surface that you are drawing on. And let's try another value, 15 here, or even 0. Sometimes you have to try different values to find out what works best, and 0 seems to be correct. And this gives you a little bit more realistic results. At the end of this little tutorial, I would like to show you another trick. You do not always have to draw the curves yourself. You can tell ZBrush where to place the curves or the stitch lines. So let me quickly create a new sphere 3D object, and I turn it into a polymesh 3D again, add a couple of subdivisions, open up the geometry tab and delete any lowers. And then I choose the slice curve brush, and I have mine located below the canvas here. And you can find yours by hitting the B key again to open up the quick menu, then S to isolate everything except the brushes that start with the letter S. And you can find the slice curve brush here. And this one basically lets you slice the mesh, and it creates a new polygroup together with a new edge loop, like so. And then I simply switch back to the select brush and isolate only this area. And when I open up the stroke palette and click on frame mesh with the border and polygroup selected, ZBrush places a curve around the visible piece of geometry. And when I now show the entire mesh again and click on the curve with our stitch brush selected, like so, ZBrush applies the stitches along the curve. So make them a little bit bigger, like so. And that makes things a lot easier, because this way, with a little bit of planning, you do not have to place the curves yourself by hand. You can use polygroups or edges of a mesh to tell ZBrush where to draw the curves, and then you simply apply the insert mesh brush by clicking on the active curve.
That's it for this tutorial. Subscribe, Leave a comment and let me know if you want to learn more about the curve tools in ZBrush. Also, let me know if you are interested in a tutorial about how to create garments in ZBrush, and I will put together something for you. So, see you in the next one. Cheers!